the Ballerina Community Call for July 2021. My name is Lakshita, and today we'll be talking mainly about changes to the HTTP package in Ballerina Swan Lake. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone who has joined from across the globe. Okay, so here's the agenda. I'll be starting with telling you about how you can get involved and show your support as a part of the Ballerina community. So let me just go to this link. You will have access to this slide deck, so you'll be able to see this. So if you go to the Ballerina platform and if you go to the community repository on GitHub, you will get a general idea about how you can do things within the Ballerina community, how you can engage with the community and also contribute to the community. So for general information, you can go to the website on ballerina.io. If you want to see major announcements, you will be able to see them on the official Ballerina blog on the website. And we also have a community page on the website, so you can get information over there as well. So here you will be able to see some things about engaging with the community, about the community call. So if you haven't yet joined our Slack channel, please join the Slack channel and post any questions or any issues you've run into while developing using Ballerina, while developing with Ballerina. And of course, we have Twitter. Follow us on Twitter. Twitter handle is Ballerinalang. So all the latest news, updates, and announcements will be posted first to Twitter. So I would strongly suggest that you follow us on Twitter. And then you have these other channels, and also subscribe to our newsletter if you want to receive the newsletter directly into your inbox. But you can also go to the website and take a look at all the past newsletters. So in terms of the community call, we try to have a community call every month, and we try to make them interactive meetings, but usually we have a general topic around which we focus the call on. And if you'd like to be notified about details of upcoming community calls, you can fill this form here. But if you want to get involved in our next call, or if you want to suggest a topic for discussion, or if you want to request to do a quick demo of your own, you can fill in this form over here. So if you want to contribute to the community, there are several ways to do that. So if you want to write content for our community, there's the Ballerina Tech blog that we host. So we can publish your blog posts over there. And if you have done any videos, vlogs, screencasts about Ballerina, please feel free to let us know about what you've done. And if you are willing to speak at meetups or conferences or other events, or even host a meetup or hackathon for our local community, we can help you get started. You can, of course, contribute to the language and publish your Ballerina module on Ballerina Central. And yeah, so you can do all of that. So if you have contributed in any of the above ways, let us know by filling in this form. All right, so now that we're done with that, so let's now get into the main event, which is to talk about changes to the HTTP package in Swan Lake. So let me first introduce you to our two speakers. We have Chamil Aladenia, who will be talking about changes to service and client implementations in the HTTP package. So he's from the standard library team in the Ballerina team. He's an associate technical lead, and he's mainly looking into looking at the HTTP module. So we also have Chanaka Lakmal, who will be covering security changes. He's also a part of the standard library team. He's also an associate technical lead in the team. So after their sessions, we will be moving on to Q&A. You can ask any questions related to the material we covered today, as well as any other Ballerina related questions you may have. All right, so without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Chamil. Chamil, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Peggy. Let me share the screen. All right. During this session, actually, we will be talking about some of the major changes we did for the HTTP package for Swan Lake version. Um, so this is the high-level content. Um, we will be going through some of the key features that we did, and in terms of the service, we will be talking about the service declaration, absolute resource path, and the resource. In terms of resource, we'll be talking about the accessor, resource name, path, and the rest parameter. And when it comes to the signature, we have some introductions like query parameter, payload, header parameters. And then we'll be talking about some of the return types. And later on, we'll move on to the HTTP client changes, mainly focusing on the response payload retrieval and the header media type arguments inclusion to the client operations. Okay. The service declaration. Service declaration is mostly used approach to define a service. In fact, it's a syntactic sugar for creating services. The service declaration gets desugared into many levels, like creating a service object, creating a listener, and then attaching the service object to the listener. So in here, so according to the spec, now the service declaration starts with the service keyword, and then you can have the service typing and the service path. So the service path, after the service path, with the on keyword onwards, you can place one or more listeners which you need your service to be up and running. The service class declaration is the other approach for defining a service. Since service is an object, it has a class declaration. Once you define the class, you can instantiate it and get the service object. By using the lifecycle methods like attach, you can add the service object into the listener. And here, this variable, this argument is the base path, which is related to the service. And the second parameter is actually defaultable parameter. The type would be the string or a string array. If you have not specified it, it will be default to the /. So now let's talk about the service constructor. The service constructor expression is also another way to get the service object. Once you have the object, you can attach it to the listener. And then, like I mentioned previously, you can use the lifecycle methods to attach it. Here, the base path is a string. As you can see, this is a string literal. So earlier it was a string array. Make sure you provide the string literal where the path segment is separated by the /. It's more like the base path. So during this discussion, I'll be mostly using the class declaration, which is this approach, to write some of the samples and show you how the behaviors would be. Now let's move on to the absolute resource path. The absolute resource path is the base path of the service. Actually, you can access the service through this base path. The absolute resource path can contain either an identifier or a string literal. Always it should start with a /. If you are using a string literal and it does not have a forward leading /, then the listener will internally add the /. Basically, this construct is actually optional. So if you have not specified it, it will be default to a /. So in this example, you can see I have added the identifier, and here I have added the string literal. Likewise, if you have some special characters like these characters, if you are using the identifier, you need to escape those with a /, or else you can simply use a string literal. All right. Now, I have completed some of the service related changes. Now let's move on to the resource changes. In terms of the resource changes, mainly we are talking about the some of the new additions. Like the before going into that, I'll talk about the concept of the resource method. Resource methods are used in the service objects to expose the service in a RESTful style. They are more like the network oriented getters and setters. So basically you will realize it when we are talking about the accessor. So in this sample, I have mentioned like a simple resource where the first keywords are the resource function, and then you have the accessor, and then you can place the resource name. After that, within brackets, you can specify whatever the signature parameters. Finally, you can place the return types. All right. The resource accessor. Resource accessor is one of the key features which brings a first-class support to HTTP by defining the accessor in the resource itself. The resource accessor confines the resource to a particular HTTP method, and you can specify the standard HTTP methods such as get, put, post. Likewise, only the compatible request will get dispatched to this resource. Otherwise, it will result in a 404 method not allowed. So here in this sample, this resource will get confined to the get request. And also, in addition to the standard HTTP methods, custom methods also can be supported. Like you can mention some of the custom methods instead of using the standard ones, but your request has to be compatible to get dispatched. And with this new addition, you can only specify one of the accessors for a particular resource. So, but in the case of writing a proxy or a default resource, you might need different methods to get dispatched to a particular resource. But to do that, we have introduced a new accessor called default. So you can have this default accessor and allow any of the HTTP methods to be dispatched into this resource. Then we have the resource name. The resource name is a relative path. Is a relative path from the absolute path. It will be used in the request dispatching as a resource path. So you can have actually multiple identifiers separated by /, as you can see in the sample. Since it's a relative path, it does not have a leading slash. And here, the dot identifier can be used to denote the current location. When you think of it as a file system, the dot stands for the current location. So any request which has only the base path will get dispatched to this resource. So in this sample, here this resource has a resource name as the dot identifier, and some of the requests like requests which contain only the base path will get dispatched here. All right. And one thing to mention, in the case of like having some of the special characters in the resource, you need to escape them using the \. And the other one is a path parameter. Path parameters are the path variables where you can place in the resource path itself. And the value of that particular path param differs from request to request. The good thing is like path parameters are included in the resource name itself. You can specify them within brackets along with the type. So it is we support like most of the primitive types like string, int, boolean, float, decimal types. And also if the URL is matched, URL string is matched, each path component will be converted into the expected type and will be available to the resource. So this example is a quite hypothetical sample to show these capabilities. Like these path params would support these sort of types, so you don't need to stick to the string path parameters. You can make use of other types as well. So before going into more details, let me show you a sample and go ahead. So this is my directory. Doesn't have anything. I'm using Ballerina Swan Lake beta 2 version. Okay, I'm going to create a new project and go into the project, and these files are being created. All right, so now the default template is a main. So I'll be creating a HTTP service. So here, this is the base path. As I talked earlier, base path or the absolute resource path. It is optional, either you can mention it or not. Here, this is the accessor, and then this is the resource name. I'll be changing it to student, and I'll placing another path parameter here, int ID. At the moment, I don't need these values. So what I want is here to return the ID as student ID. Okay. So this is my core request. So the base path is slash, the services is up and running on port 8080, and the resource path is student, and I'll be passing a 98 as a path parameter. So when you send the request, the 98 part will be converted into an int and will be returned. So this is how you use the path parameters as a small sample. And then let's talk about the rest parameters. Rest parameter is some kind of a extended version of the path parameters. It allows multiple path segments to be dispatched in the absence of a specific path match. And you need to, especially you need to understand that you need to place this rest parameter as the last parameter of the path segments. Now let's change the sample a bit and see how it works, like how it behaves. I want to change this into rest parameter, and so I'll be sending another. Sorry. Now, once you add the rest parameter, the ID type will be a array. So I need to get the first element. So instead of sending 98, I'll be sending some more values. Okay, the request got dispatched because it doesn't have any other specific match. So all the other components will get matched after the student will get matched into this array. The first element is this one. So I have got the response in the same manner. So that's about the rest parameter. So you can make use of it. It's more like a wildcard for your API design. Also, I'll show you some other example as well. So to show the how dispatching works. So this is student foo. Now I have two resources. One is student foo, one is a student with the rest parameter. I'll run this and see, show you how it works. So now if I send the request as student foo, it should ideally get here. Yes, we got the response, correct response. So if I send something like this, now it got it didn't come here because the JSON key is name. Now here it's a student ID. That means it has gone here because it has multiple segments. This is the not the specific match. It got dispatched here. So that's about the rest parameter. And then we have the use case of having default resource. Now, earlier I mentioned something about the having a default as the accessor where you allow any of the HTTP methods to get in. And now we have a rest parameter where you allow any part to get in. Now this resource will behave as a proxy or the default resource, which gets invoked from request, which does not have a specific match. So same, if I change the same request, you can simply have the default keyword as accessor and have the rest parameter. So anything, any request will get dispatched here. All right. So those are the things about the resource name. Now let's move on to the resource signature parameters. Resource signature parameters also have improved with some of the new additions, like you don't need to specify the caller or the request. You don't need to define the call or the request. And also we have introduced query, payload, header parameters to the signature. Annotations are not required for query, call, and request, but other params would need different annotations. We will come to that later. So this is the sample request with a full set of signature parameters. And the conceptual change what we have here is like your first choice should be to avoid the call and the request as much as possible and use the other signature parameters and the return types. You can now return values from the resource and you don't need to specifically use a call unless you have a specific requirement, such as like getting metadata about the caller. And also you can get rid of the request as we have provided both payload and the header in the signature. But this is not a restriction, but you can use this optimized functionality to improve the readability. So about the query parameter, query parameter is a new addition. Like you don't have to specify any of the annotation or any additional details. You can take the URL parameters into the, you can take those URL parameter which is coming in the request URL into signature during the resource invocation. These are the types we are supporting, basically the primary types, and they are array types and the nillable and the nil. So this is a sample where you have used all the types. And so one thing I have to mention is like, now if the request does not contain the query parameter, this request will end up being a 400 bad request. So to get rid of or to avoid that, you can simply mention it, make it nillable. So if the query parameter is not available, it will, the ID value will be a nil. And also the other thing is like query parameter key can have multiple values. So make sure to use a string array. So all the values will be available in this string array. The other thing is you don't need an annotation to have query parameters. The payload parameter is also very common one, and it does have a annotation called HTTP payload. So I think these are the types we are supporting: string, JSON, XML, byte array, record, and record array. And make sure to use the HTTP payload annotation in front of that. So what happens here is when you get the inbound request with the JSON payload or whatever the payload, the type, according to this type, the payload will be passed and will be available in the signature to use inside the resource. So that's a bit about the payload parameter. And then we have the another new addition, that is a header parameter. Headers also can be accessed using the signature parameters, like in the whatever the you get from the request headers will be available in the signature. So it also comes with the annotation like HTTP header. If you want to access a single header, you can specify it like this with the type of string. The referrer is the header name, and if you have some other name, you can place it inside this annotation under this name field. And if you want to access multiple header values for a single header, for example, the accept header would have multiple header values. So in that case, you can specify the type as string array. Otherwise, if you have specified in the string, only the first value will be returned as the will be assigned to the this referrer. Rather than defining a single headers, if you want to access all the headers, mention this HTTP headers object on the signature. So what happens is all the headers in the inbound request will be populated in this header, and use these support methods to access the headers. All right. Now we talked about the query parameter, payload parameter, and the header parameter. Now let's move on to the caller and the request. The caller, actually, we have introduced a new annotation for caller. This caller is to denote the response payload type. This change is mainly focusing on the OpenAPI spec generation, where you can specify the type of the payload. So the resource interface itself provides the detail about the type of the payload. So otherwise, this interface would not understand the type where we pass in this section. So this is also kind of improvement, like which is focusing on the OpenAPI generation. All right, now let's move a bit about to talk about the resource return types. Earlier we had error and the nil as return types, but now it has changed to accept any data, HTTP response, HTTP status code response records, and error on it. So the special thing about this concept is like you can decorate your return types using the HTTP payload annotations. Like it's more like you are overriding your content type payload, content type header actually. And the other thing is like when you are returning some data, any data from this resource, or it always end up being a 200 OK response. So we will talk about something called status code records in the next slide, which might help you to change those status code. So in this sample, we have written a string. In here, we have written a table of array of, yes, person table. This is an array. So one thing I have to mention here is like if you want to override this media type, you can simply add it here, and the default ones will be thrown away, and this will override this particular header. Now let's move into a simple sample to depict some of the key changes we discussed earlier. So I have this sample already. Now this is an example to show how the query parameter would work. Here I have two query parameters, int A and int B. The path is path is count. So this is the curl request that I'm going to use to call this function. Okay, now the request has a two query parameters, a equals 5 and the b equals 2. So I have got the correct answer as a plus b equals 7. All right, this is how you specify the query parameters, and then you already know how to define payload parameter. So here I have the payload parameter defined, and I'm expecting a student record from the request. So this is my client. I'm calling the port 1990 and the path is /student. And this is my payload. Payload contains a JSON. So I can bind the JSON into a record. So let's see. All right. I have sent the name as John. So the JSON is being retrieved and converted into a student. I'm accessing the name of the student. Name is John. So I have got it correctly. And the other one is the header parameter. I'll show that one as well. So here I have the header parameter. I'm expecting the referrer header. So this is my call request. So I'm calling this resource /header, and I'm sending the referrer header like this. All right, I have sent the value as ABC, and I have also returned the same value. So it works correctly. All right, then let's move on to returning some values from the request. So here I'm returning a string, and also I'm overriding the content type header. The path is /test. Yes, I have. All right, here what happens is I have got the response as 200 okay, as I mentioned earlier, and also the content type is being overridden as text ID plain. All right, now let's move on to the status code records. These are the built-in records for all the status codes. Earlier, when you return any data from the resource, it led to a 200 okay. But if you use this approach, you can simply change the status code as well. These records contains 4 fields, as you can see. The first one is a status, which is optional, which is a read-only field. You don't need to change it. And the rest of the fields are pretty similar to a response object. So the concept behind of this is to get rid of the response object. Instead of the response object, you can simply use this status code record. So here you have the body, which is a payload. Here you have the header, and here we have special case, the media type. So so this is a sample for the 200 okay response now, but you can have different records for each and every status code from the HTTP package itself. So here, this is the HTTP internal server error record, which return a 500 okay response. So what you need to do here is like you simply add the payload under the in the body field and have headers inside the header field. So if I show you the behavior quickly. So the path is /greeting, and I'm sending a get request. So we need to check the verb. So now I have returned okay record. So it has ended up being a 200 okay. Now I have all the payload. This payload is correct, and I have these two headers and this one as well. Now I'm doing a little change here. So this is error. Now let's see. Okay, now I have got the 500 response. All right, that's one of the advantage of using these response records. And the other one is like this is a sample to use a type inclusion and change the response record type. Here body is not any data. Earlier it was we expect the payload type, the body type as any data, but now here I have like defined the inline record, and the type of the body is restricted to the person, and also have used this type inclusion and have included the fields of the created record. So when you are returning this response, it should automatically return a 201 created response. Let's check that as well. So this is the same sample. Okay, here I have got the 201 response correctly, and along with that I have got the particular headers and the content type and also the payload. So that's about the status code records, where you can use to get rid of having always the 200 response. So now let's move on to the returning nil. In this sample, user has only consumed the inbound request payload and has only printed something. But eventually, the the resource execution ends up, and then it has an implicit return. So since user has not responded previously using either using a call or returning anything, this will understand, this behavior will understand, the listener will understand the behavior and simply return a 202 accepted response. So when you have not responded from a response from a resource, so simply what we could see is a 202 response from the resource. So the other behavior is like if the resource is already dealt with the response using the caller, then returning nil does not lead to a subsequent request, because with the request response paradigm, you only send the response once. So listener is aware of that, and he understands the resource is being, the resource has a concept, this response method. So if the flow goes in here, so he understands that the particular request is being served by response. So this will not end up being a 202 response. It's just ending the flow. And then the other case is like when you have the HTTP caller. When you have the HTTP caller in a resource, we have restricted to return only the error or nil as a return types. That is mainly focusing on the code readability, and it improves the readability. Otherwise, one flow will have a return, and the other flow will have a respond method. So with that in mind, if you return some nil value from a resource rather than using a respond method, it will end up being a 500 response. So if I explain it further, so here in the if clause, user has responded correctly, and in the else case, it has been just returning nil. So since before this return, there are no any response method. So listener will understand that there has not been a previous response for this particular request. So it will consider it as a 500 internal error. And then also we can return some errors from the response. Errors, when you returning an error from a response from a request, it will ended up being a 500 internal error, and also it prints the stack trace on the server console. So this will apply to check and the check panic operations as well. So now quickly move on to the HTTP client related changes. Mainly it focusing on the client data binding and the payload retrieval. The client operation is capable of inferring the expected type from the left-hand side variable type. Now, if you can see this method, this remote method does not specify what's the payload type that you need, but it has a capability to infer the expected type from the left-hand side variable type. So that is one of the useful feature that you can add to your program. So you don't need to specify the target type here. You can just leave it like this. So the client operation can infer it from the left hand side. So, and the other thing is, like, if you in the case of using a var, this is actually not recommended, but if you have the requirement to use a var, then you have to pass the type disk inside this call, inside this operation for this target type argument. And the other thing is, like, when you are doing the response payload retrieval using the client operation, the backend can send error messages, error responses as well, like 400 range 1 or 500 range 1. But those are not being eligible to do the payload binding because they are not the success responses. So what happens is they will be automatically converted into Ballerina errors rather than being responses or anything. It will be converted into response in the Ballerina errors. So mainly we have the 400 range ones will be this HTTP client request errors, and the 500 ones will be remote server errors. So one cool thing is, like, if you have the error, but still if you want to access their headers or their error response body, you can access the error detail and access those fields. Those fields are available only specifically to these sort of HTTP error types. So the payload binding is one step further the previously talked version. That is, like, you get the payload from the response, and then you convert into a record. So this is one option that you can. So you don't, either you can specify this as a JSON, or else you can define it as a person. When you have the payload as a JSON, so you can simply put a JSON here. So what happens is you get the client will get the inbound payload and pass it to a JSON, and then it checks whether what's the payload type they want, and if it is a person record, it will bind it to a person record. So let me do a quick sample on that, so you will understand how it behaves. So this is a main function. So what I'm doing here is I have a HTTP client, and this is a endpoint which returns a JSON. So here I have mentioned my expected type as a JSON. So let's run it and see. Okay, I have got some JSON here, and now I want to change it a bit. I will be using var here. So when you use the var, there will be a problem. Yes, it cannot infer. So you need to change this target type equals JSON. and then you run it. Okay, I have got the same answer. Now I'm changing this a bit. So I don't have the JSON here. Instead of that, I have a person record. Let's run this and see. Even when I'm printing, I'm accessing the payload, the record fields. Okay, I have got the correct response. Hello. Like the access fields are there. All right. That's about the payload binding, and also you can still use the HTTP response, because if you need to dig deeper into some of the properties of the inbound response or the headers and all, and you can still use the HTTP response. So when you have the response, those error responses like 400, 500 response will not be converted into errors. They will be written as usual responses. And then the next part is having headers and the media type in the client remote methods. So non-entity body methods like get head options, they don't actually need the entity body. So we have introduced the header field for that. So they can simply send headers in here. If you specifically want to send a payload with the get request, you still can use the execute method. The HTTP client has the execute method. You can use it. And then for the entity body methods like post, put, delete, patch, for those methods, we have introduced two arguments like headers map and the media type. We have taken out the media type and we have special cased it. So those are some of the changes that we wanted to cover during this call. So after that, we'll see about the service related, security related changes. So I'll hand over this session to Chanak. Chanak.
Thanks, Tamil. Let me share my screen first. Okay, in this section, we are going to discuss how to secure our HTTP service and HTTP client in Ballerina. So in both HTTP service and client, we can categorize security methods into two sections: transport layer security and application layer security. As you can see in the presentation, we have options like SSL, TLS, and MTLS under the transport layer security, and basic code JWT, Auth and Auth2 under application layer security. The only difference here is how we configure the Ballerina service or the client. Let's see how to configure security for HTTP service. Here we have three levels of configurations. The first one is secure socket config under listener configurations. And this is the place where we configure SSL or TLS, transport layer security configurations. And the next two are auth configurations under service annotation and the resource annotation. And this is the place where we configure application layer security like basic code, JWT, and Auth2, etc. Now let's see how to secure the HTTP client. Here all the configurations comes under HTTP client configurations. Here we have also we have secure socket configuration where we define the transport layer security, and the application layer security will be gone under auth configuration. First, let's see how we can configure HTTP service for transport layer security. If we need to configure SSL or TLS for HTTP service, this is how we can do that. Under the secure socket config, we can configure the key field, which has two fields like cert file and the key files, which is basically for the public certificate and the private key of the server. And if we need to configure for mutual TLS like MTLS for HTTP service, this is how we can do that. Under the same secure socket config, we can configure the mutual SSL field in addition to what we have done in the previous step. Now let's see how we can configure HTTP service for application layer security. Let's look at the authentication methods first. Here, we are going to secure our HTTP service for basic code with the use of a file user store. which means the data of the authenticated users and their permissions are provided by a file in a TOML format. What we have to do is just to configure the auth field of the HTTP service annotation like this. Then when we have done, then we have to define a config.toml file like this. That's it. Once this is done, the incoming request will be authenticated against the configured user store. Next, we have basic auth with the use of a LDAP user store. The only difference here is the file user store config we have configured earlier now being replaced as LDAP user store config. For the simplicity of the code, I have removed some fields here. Next, if you are going to secure service with JWT auth, yes, this is the sample. As you can see, we have JWT validator config here with the configuration that we need to validate the JWT like issuer, audience, and signature config, etc. The most important thing is there are 3 ways that you can validate the signature of your JWT. The first one is you can use your public certificate or trust store configurations and JWKS endpoint. Next, we are going to secure the HTTP service with auth2. As you can see here, we have configured the auth2 introspection config with the configuration that we need to validate the incoming auth2 access token. Here, what we do is we introspect the incoming access token with the configured identity provider or secure token service. Okay, now let's see how to configure the authorizations. Let's take this previous sample for JWT authentication we used. As you can see here, we have configured a field called scopes in addition to JWT validator configuration we had. In Ballerina, we use scopes where we define a single scope or multiple scopes that the service should be authorized to. The same concept applies for each and every authentication protocol in Ballerina. Now let's see how we can configure HTTP client with transport layer security. If you need to configure SSL or TLS for HTTP client, this is how we can do that. It is quite same as that we have done for HTTP service, but the configurations here comes under HTTP client configuration. Next, if we need to configure HTTP client for a mutual TLS like MTLS, this is how we can do that. We have to configure the key and cert fields of the secure socket config. Now let's see how we can configure the application layer security for HTTP client. Here we are going to secure HTTP client with basic code. What we have to do is configure the auth field of the client configuration with the required username and password. And here we are going to secure HTTP client again with JWT auth. Here we have 2 options. The first one is the bearer token method. This is used when we need to send a JWT, which we already have. As you can see, we have configured the token like this. And the second one is the self-signed JWT. This means this is used when we need to send a JWT, which is generated by the microservice itself and signed using its private key. This is normally used the communication between microservices where the receiving microservice trusts the sending microservice. And the final one, the client auth2. Here we have 4 options to configure. The first one is bearer token method. This is 100% same as the JWT bearer token method. The only difference is we can use access token instead of a JWT token, but the token can be either JWT or in auth2. The second one is the client credential grant type. This is the one of the 3 grant types that's supported by Ballerina according to auth2 specification. Here we are configuring Ballerina HTTP client like this, and internally Ballerina will call to this token URL configured here and get the access token and use it for API call authentications. The next one is password grant type. Here also we are configuring the Ballerina HTTP client like this. As same as in the client credential grant type, Ballerina will call to the token URL and get the access token for authentication. And additionally, if user has configured the refresh config here, if the access token get expired, it will be automatically refreshed. The next one, the final one would be the refresh token grant type. Here we are configuring the Ballerina HTTP client like this. As in the previous 2 grant types, Ballerina will internally call to the refresh URL and get the access token for the next API authentication call. Okay, let's quickly move into the live demonstration and see how we can secure HTTP service and the client. Here we have HTTP listener, which is secured with SSL. And we have a HTTP service, which is attached to that secured listener. And then as you can see here, we have HTTP service annotation. Inside the auth field of here, we have configured for basic auth and JWT auth. And most importantly, we have configured the scopes in both steps as well. Since we have configured the basic auth, as you already know, we need to configure file user store because we are configuring basic auth file user store method. So here's my file user store. I have two users, Alice and Bob. These are their password, and the Alice have two permission scopes like admin and developer, but the Bob has only developer permission. Let's try out this. Once you invoke this curl request, it should get a 401 response since it is not authorized. Let's invoke again with the successful user. Let's use Alice. It should get a successful response now. Yes, we can see it's 200 OK response with successful payload hello world. And if you invoke this same service with the second user who doesn't have the permission to invoke this service, sorry, the password should be 456. Now you get the 403 forbidden. It means Bob user doesn't get authorized to use this. And as you can see here, since we have configured the service with both basic auth and JWT auth, let's once try one more time again with the JWT, which I already have. Okay, you can see the successful response here. Okay, we can configure the Ballerina HTTP client for the same purpose. Like I have defined, I can configure the auth field like this. And since it is secured with basic auth, I can just put the username and password like this and invoke the same service. Okay, it is getting the same service, same response as said over. Let's move back to the slide. So far, we looked into both HTTP service and client authentication methods. Actually, these are the declarative way of handling authentication and authorization. There is another way, which is called imperative method of handling authentication and authorization. Let's quickly take a look at this. Here also, I want my HTTP service to be authenticated with JWT and to be authorized for the scope of admin. And there is no any difference with the listener initialization. But here you can see we have created a listener JWT auth handler object with the same JWT validator configurations. And next, we do not annotate anything for the resource or the service. And instead of that, what we do is we call the authenticate and authorize APIs using those handlers. And based on those calls, there are particular responses for authenticate and authorizations. For this JWT auth handler, we get JWT payload or unauthorized response. And for authorized API call, we get forbidden or nil. Based on those responses, we can take our own decisions and response as we needed. Like this, here we respond a string or unauthorized response or forbidden. Likewise, there are handler objects provided for HTTP library for all the client and services authentication methods. We can use these based on the requirement, but most importantly, this imperative method should not be the first choice. This can be used in advanced use cases like implementing security for a web hub, etc. Okay, thanks for joining. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask.
Oh, if you have any questions, you can type here on Zoom or also on YouTube. So let's give it a few minutes and see if anyone has any questions. So if you do have any questions later on, please feel free to submit those questions on our Slack channel. And also the recording of this call will be up on our YouTube channel, that is Ballerinalang. So you can check check the questions and also the video. And sorry, I thought we got a question. No, all right. Thank you for joining, Julie. Yes, so if you want to check the recording, go to our YouTube channel. All right. Okay, thank you so